Hello, and welcome to the Kinder Institute's Urban Reads series. I'm Ruth Lopez Turley, professor of sociology at Rice University, and I'm also the associate director of the Kinder Institute, as well as director of the Houston Education Research Consortium, a program of the Kinder Institute. The Kinder Urban Reads series showcases recently published books by both regional and national authors. We ask that you live tweet using hashtag KIUrbanReads, and that you follow us on Twitter at RiceKinderInst and at RiceKinderHerc. There will be a time for Q&A with the audience, so if you have any questions, please put them on the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. And also note that you can like other people's questions, as this will increase the likelihood of us getting to them. So today's featured speaker is Rucker Johnson. He is author of Children of the Dream: Why School Integration Works. In this book, Johnson shows that integration worked and that it benefited all of us. Here's the book. I strongly encourage everyone to read this book if you have not done so already. Now, a little bit about Rucker Johnson. He is the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy in the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. He's a labor economist who specializes in the economics of education. He's also a faculty research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His work considers the role of poverty and inequality and its impact on life chances. His research has appeared in leading academic journals, featured in mainstream media outlets, and he has even been invited by the White House to give policy briefings on Capitol Hill. I have had the privilege of knowing Rucker Johnson for quite a few years. I believe we first met when he was still at the University of Michigan, and I was sort of next door at the University of Wisconsin. And it's been great to keep up with his work over the years. He has done fantastic work. So I am thrilled to welcome Rucker Johnson as today's Urban Reads speaker. Welcome, Rucker.
It's so great to be with you all. Ruth, thank you for that generous introduction. I want to thank Rose and the Kinder Institute, Rice University, for organizing and allowing me to participate in today's event. Thanks so much.
Oh, as Rucker gets ready to begin, I just want to note that he has given me permission to interrupt him while he speaks, so I will be doing that, and of course I will also be helping to guide the Q&A session afterwards. So make sure that you all are entering your questions as he speaks as well.
Okay, great. So I'm going to kick off the discussion, and then I'm going to hopefully open up, but I certainly want to engage questions throughout. I'll go ahead and proceed now. So, you know, the two areas that have the biggest impacts on opportunity for children are in education and housing. And yet these are precisely the areas in which civil rights have made the least progress due to segregation. And when we think about segregation, but really when we think about the goals of integration, it's not only about assignments of children to schools by race, but it's essentially about school funding, equitable resources, teacher quality, teacher diversity, curricular quality, and the heavy reliance historically on the local property tax wealth to fund public schools is another form of segregation, both then and now. And so the thrust of the book is really to recognize that how we got here and where we are today have to draw on the lessons of the past lessons of some of our most ambitious equal educational opportunity policies. And so the three big ones that I take up in the book that I think are some of the central ones to move us forward are recommitting to school integration. So we have school desegregation, school funding reforms, and expansions of early pre-K investments. Those have been the three significant equal education opportunity initiatives in the past, but there's a lot of policy amnesia, and there's a lot of barriers to change, but a significant one is misconceptions about the evidence on each of those three policies. Now, when we use data as a time machine and go back to investigate kind of what impacts do we see along those dimensions when those policies were pursued, I want to highlight that there are three myths about school integration that you'll hear a lot. One is that we tried it for a very long time. In fact, then we celebrated the 65th anniversary of Brown just a year or two ago. That it didn't work, that it had no lasting impacts, and that it's no longer relevant. Now, obviously, I wouldn't be here if I didn't want to inject some truth in each of those sentences, that when we look and investigate the timing and the efforts of integration, there's only a 15-year window in which significant integration efforts occurred. That when we actually look at that window in which integration efforts occurred, we see that the Black test score gap among students on the eve of the Brown decision and those born 30 years later declined by nearly 40%. And along every other marker of educational equity, educational convergence, Black-white educational convergence, earnings, health, we see the greatest convergence in Black-white differences in attainment for the cohorts that were exposed to integrated schools. Now, the aspect of it no longer being relevant is simply that we have regressed to the level of segregation that prevailed in the early 70s. And that's through a number of factors that I want to highlight. But the main thing is this rapid reduction, this 40% reduction in the Black-white achievement gap. We see it in reading. This is drawn from Sean Reardon and other people's work. I want to have us understand that there's not been a further closing in the Black-white test score gap since the 80s. And we don't want to confuse this large achievement gap with the underlying, the symptom of these achievement gaps with the underlying disease, which is gaping educational opportunity gaps along race and class lines that preceded them beginning in the pre-K years. Now, what we're trying to further address is often you'll hear people say, look at how much education spending has increased since the early 70s, and they'll document the 192% increase in spending. If you look at the time series data on aggregate education spending, and they'll simultaneously show the time series on educational achievement, again, and as evidence that school spending doesn't matter. Okay. Now, what we try to address is that you have to have data that's longitudinal, that can follow children from birth to adulthood, in a way to isolate the effects of these policies independent of other factors. And so that's what we try to take up here. I think I want to highlight some of the key components that entrench school segregation today, because the nature of segregation today is quite different than it was in the earlier era of the integration efforts, okay? Now, when you think about contemporary policy influences on school level segregation, one must consider the school siting, school closing, the ways in which there have been gerrymandered school district boundaries in ways that are segregative, the ways in which the creation of new districts in outlying areas, the kind of middle class flight, as well as the student assignment questions. Part of this is also connected to the unregulated growth of charter schools that have actually exacerbated some school segregation issues in certain communities across the country. Now, what's key is housing policy is very much implicated centrally, particularly in the contemporary school segregation. So contemporary school segregation, about 2/3 of segregation today occurs between districts. So in the earlier era, most of the segregation was within district lines. So housing policies, zoning restrictions, minimum lot sizes, provision of government services, housing subsidies that concentrate poverty in many respects are ways in which we don't have enough emphasis on mixed income housing. And you have the private actors of real estate practice of steering and mortgage lending discrimination that still goes on today. In addition, and we saw that even with the home foreclosure crisis that instigated some of the Great Recession. We saw that targeting of minority neighborhoods with balloon interest rate mortgages, but all of this is against a backdrop of a legacy of government-sponsored segregation with restricted covenants, segregated housing projects. Richard Rothstein has documented, in addition to the placement of highways that divided communities in ways that expedited segregation. Now, a lot of times people focus on segregation at the district level, but when you look within schools, that even districts that look ostensibly diverse, a magnet school with seemingly a diverse set of racial ethnic composition, that when we look within those schools, oftentimes there's racialized tracking beginning in the earliest elementary school grades, in third grade, for example, where you see college preparatory tracks disproportionately represented with non-Hispanic whites and Asians, with Black and Hispanic children relegated to lower track, and ways in which that kind of implicit bias sometimes with regard to expectations for child achievement that entrench unequal access to opportunity. Now, what I want to just do quickly is to provide a roadmap of where we have been so that we can kind of trace out the generational impact of these policies. And what I want to highlight is that oftentimes people think of integration and desegregation interchangeably. What I want to highlight is moving from desegregation to integration. It means moving from access to inclusion. It means moving from exposure to understanding. And that requires all of the connectivity between school resource equity and curricular quality, multicultural curricula, teacher diversity. It's not only the assignment of school children to schools. Now, when we look at on the eve of the Brown decision, we see certainly where legal segregation was required throughout the formerly Confederate South, and we see that includes Texas, but we see California legal segregation prohibited. We see the strong regional pattern. Generally, people think of the Brown decision as this one case, Topeka, Kansas, but really it was 6 cases across 6 different states. And the theme of the book is also to use not just one case study of a single area, but nationally representative data drawn from successive generations of cohorts that were exposed to different degrees of integration. Okay, so when we look at the timing of integration efforts, it was very much little integration efforts occurred in the first decade after Brown. And so it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that put teeth in enforcement that we saw significant movement in integration efforts. This map is just going to show you the timing of where integration efforts occurred. Again, no limited integration in the first decade after Brown, with a rapid expansion and intensity throughout the 70s, early 80s, where we reached peak integration levels in 1988. And then through a series of conservative Supreme Court cases that led to a release of court orders beginning in the early 90s, led to a return to neighborhood schools. And so what we try to document is contrasting cohorts that were from children from the same schools across cohorts that were exposed to different levels of integration. What we try to do in the book, though, is also the quantitative data give us an aerial view of what the impacts may be. But there's a lot left out, and a lot that the quantitative data, while it can give us the causal rigor of causal effects, the mechanism and the actual processes about how it was implemented, we marry the quantitative data with qualitative in-depth interviews with the pioneers of desegregation, the pioneers of the first cohorts of Head Start and early school finance reform cases. We do interviews with some of the early judges that ruled on these cases. And this is an example. I have here the kindergarten class, the first integrated cohort of Chicago public schools, Avalon Park Elementary School in 1964. We highlight in the third row, Paul Gorin. Now he's now Dr. Paul Gorin, superintendent of schools in Evanston. He is the white male child, like 4 students in, and his classmate would also become a doctor, African-American doctor, that would become one of the first to integrate Chicago area hospitals. But at this time, they were classmates and their families would become close. And this experience of integration very much shaped Dr. Gorin's subsequent career dedicated to issues of educational equity. And it's really these experiences that were shaping those experiences. Now, what he highlights is how his parents received just an onslaught of pressure from real estate agents for their family to move, which definitely was a catalyst with white flight. So 1964, this is his kindergarten class. This is 1967. Now you can see Paul Gorin still in the third row, all the way to the right. I'll say all the way to the left. But you can also see most of his white classmates had already left by 1967. And similarly, this is his elementary school class in 5th and 6th grade. You can see him on the front row still smiling. But it's that white flight and resistance that we see not just in the South. That was Chicago. This is Dorothy Towns-Scoggins on the first day that she integrated schools in North Carolina. In Charlotte in particular, we do in-depth interviews there, as well as this is Dewania Kyles on the first day that she integrated the Memphis public schools. So it's really marrying these in-depth interviews with the pioneers of integration that we really get a sense of the challenge and the effort. When we look back at the quantitative data, we see despite that white flight, there was a 30 percentage point reduction in school segregation. And what people fail to kind of also recognize is a big part beyond the school segregation was that school spending before these integration efforts, the allocation of district level spending was disproportionately allocated to the majority white schools. What integration did is it leveled up spending to the level that white children were previously getting. So we see about a 20% increase in the exposure of Black children's spending, and for those exposed to integrated schools throughout their school age years versus children from those same schools that were confined to the segregated system. Okay, now that led to a significant reduction in class size. That school resource equity we document had a big part of what ensued. In particular, in the 8 years leading up to the desegregation court orders, we see parallel trends between white and Black children. But then after the court order takes effect, we see a demonstratively improvement in educational attainment, about more than a full year of educational attainment for children exposed to integrated schools throughout their school age years, relative to those same Black children from previous cohorts who were confined to segregated schools throughout their school age years. And what's important is that the magnitude of these increases in educational attainment, we see it along increases in high school graduation, college degree attainment, college attendance rates, to a point where by the early 80s to mid 80s, 18 and 19-year-old Black and white college enrollment rates mirrored one another, that they had roughly converged by that time, and we document school desegregation efforts were a critical component of that. Now,
Rucker, if I may interrupt there. So you're showing these like obvious, really high benefits associated with integration, and yet it didn't last. And I know you're going there shortly, but so some of our audience are asking some questions about why it took so long to get this information, the data out there. So if I may read to you one of the questions, it feels like it takes so long to get the data to show that a policy is good or bad, right? In this case, it is obviously effective. And then in the meantime, good policies get reversed, and then the effects of these policies, we miss out on the continued effects of these policies. So do you think that this is part of the explanation for why integration didn't last? Was it a lack of data and information getting out there to people, or was it something else?
So I'm not gonna make a case that research evidence is sufficient, but I will say that when we partner the research community with the practitioner community, with the parent community, and the policy community. And we kind of do the practice, policy, research continuum and integrate those parts. So when I talk about integration, you may hear it as a policy, but I am actually also invoking it as the very approach to policy, that we have to get out of the silos of sociology, economists and political science, all siloed, education and health, all in their own bubble vacuum, but kind of engage in the bi-directional exchange of both information and also the kind of communications campaign that's necessary to build a multiracial coalition about the value of diversity that actually eludes statistical observation. So you're going to hear me talk about the impacts of educational attainment, earnings, the reductions in poverty that ensued, but I also want to highlight that there are other outcomes of the equitable school and integration efforts that cannot be captured in a test score. They can't be captured in statistical quantitative metrics. Like, for example, the impacts on racial attitudes, social cohesion, the reduction of racial intolerance, right? These are aspects that we also document, but they're less easy to document simply by looking at singular measures of success. And it's also important to highlight education is the work of generations. You have to sustain these efforts for significant periods of time to see their cumulative impacts. That doesn't mean that we should wait till a whole generation of students go through schools to assess their impacts, but it does mean we should be slow to abandon efforts after 2 years when we don't see something that shows up in a short run test score. So let me just both highlight the point that's raised is critical and also continue so that I can come back and develop that fuller. Is that okay, Ruth?
Sounds great.
So we show high school graduation. We show that these effects, again, you have to follow the same children from birth to adulthood. You don't see this if you're just looking at time series data without connecting where is their, what access to schools did they have? So we are able to link nationally representative data from the panel study of income dynamics so that we have more than 13,000 children that can be followed from birth to adulthood that overlap this period of cohorts between 1950 and 1975 who've been followed to the present. We see about a 30% increase in wages for children exposed to integrated schools throughout their school age years relative to Black children confined to segregated schools. And again, no negative effects for whites. And again, on issues about poverty reduction and the reductions in the annual incidence of poverty, what I want you to see is this dose response, that the longer children are treated for the symptoms of segregated, poorly funded education, and the higher doses of integration and school funding reform that are administered, the better are their outcomes found to be in adulthood. And the effect of attending integrated schools for all K-12 years was large enough to eliminate the average Black-white educational attainment gap. So that's what's key. And another part of it is that we typically focus on educational outcomes when we're talking about educational interventions. But I want to highlight that some of the greatest antidotes to reductions in criminal involvement are actually investments early in quality schools for children that are otherwise exposed to high poverty schools. And we see this translate that it's not only school integration, but it was also hospital integration that combined to impact school learning outcomes in addition to later life health outcomes. So the access to pediatric care, the continuity of care, and the ways in which education significantly affects the trajectory of health. Now, I want to highlight that educational equity cannot be achieved solely through the lens and instruments of integration, but through quality pre-K investments. We see that roughly half of the achievement gap that we see among third graders, half of that gap was already present at kindergarten entry. And that simply highlights the important role of school readiness of being able to take advantage of learning opportunities that happen later. Now, what typically happens is that researchers typically approach this set of questions by tackling each policy separately. And we took that approach in some way too, but we then began to look at what are the combined effects. That if we think about school integration, school funding reform, quality pre-K, they all have goals of addressing educational inequity in the system, but they do it in different ways, right? School integration does it by redistributing school children. School funding reform does it by redistributing resources. Early pre-K expansions do it by redistributing the timing of investments back to the earliest years of cognitive development. It's when we do all three in combination that we have the biggest transcendent, transformational impacts on children's life chances. So we go on to document impacts on public pre-K investments. Head Start was our largest federal funding Ronson and Lyndon Johnson administration. This timing of the Head Start centers across the country is what we use to use the timing of Head Start spending in the first 15 years of the program. Again, for these earlier cohorts to show cohorts that were otherwise similar, but had access to quality pre-K, and how that intersected with their access to K-12 school resources. What we find is that when children attend high quality pre-K, but they're subsequently combined to poorly funded K-12 schools, we see that the effects of that pre-K investment fade out, that they don't have lasting impacts in the same way that when we have those same investments in pre-K, that when they're sustained in the K-12 years. And what's important about this is you're hearing like an earlier era narrative, but even today, school spending disparities, because of the heavy reliance on local property tax wealth, still plague many states today. So Pennsylvania is one of the most regressive state systems. We see about affluent districts spending about a third more in spending than poor districts, even though the poor districts have much higher need, higher concentrations of poverty, special needs, English language learners, that all have greater costs with regard to achieving the same quality. So what we do is combine the timing of the Head Start with school funding reforms to document the synergistic effects that when we do both in combination. And what we see is the effects, whether it's high school graduation, whether it's adult wages, or whether it's the likelihood of being poor in adulthood, that the effects of Head Start access are doubled when children go to well-funded schools relative to poorly funded schools, that the effects of K-12 spending are roughly doubled when they're preceded by quality Head Start versus not having access to quality pre-K programs. And so that's a big through line of this work, is to highlight that we can't have a singular approach to systemic inequality. It has to be systemic reform that couples these three in combination. And one of the things that we miss here is, again, talking about where are we today and what things have led to the resegregation of schools. Again, the early 90s was capstoned with the 2007 Parents Involved case that involved Louisville and Seattle that ruled race could not be used solely for student school assignment. There's many misunderstandings of that ruling, but unfortunately, it determined as equivalent those policies that are trying to eradicate the legacy of racial discrimination with those that have been used as instruments to reinforce it. So that is unfortunate, and that's part of what comes in view when we think about why we have to resurrect the movement on integration. As Dr. King well articulated the contact hypothesis, which is a big part of the impacts of the public mission of schools, is the ways in which it affects children, racial attitudes, and their exposure to diversity in developing that leadership set of qualities. Dr. King put this contact hypothesis in this way: people fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they're not communicating with each other. So we use data that's nationally representative that looks at how the diversity of schools affect children's adult attitudes in adulthood on racial attitudes, as well as the kind of increased polarization of our political views. And we document that exposure to diversity significantly lessens political polarization of views in adulthood based on that childhood exposure to diversity, as well as reduces racial intolerance indices that we're able to measure. Now, in the interest of time, because I want to be able to close in this next 5 minutes, I want to highlight that when we had the release of court orders, it's not through the peer effects primarily that some of the effects for Black children's outcomes were negatively affected, that before the release of court orders, there was a pre-existing positive trend in, say, high school graduation rates because those schools had some kind of integration efforts happening. After the release of the court order, there was a greater concentration of poverty in those schools that led to an outmigration of the highest quality teachers from high poverty districts. And it's that teacher quality component that then subsequently led to a stagnation in subsequent educational improvements. And so I want to highlight, for example, that 1 in 5 teachers leaves the profession within the first 5 years of their career. That's on average. In high poverty districts, that is 1 in 2. That is roughly 50% of teachers are leaving the profession. That kind of high level of teacher turnover leaves in its vacuum a very large number of inexperienced teachers and less quality in the classroom. So that is part of why when we look at, say, Sean Reardon's nationally represented data, this is a scatter plot where every dot represents a district, and every district in the country is represented. Here I've highlighted Massachusetts, who has a very progressive funding system and has a very high degree of per pupil spending, relative to California before its most recent efforts to expand their public school investments in more equitable ways through the local control funding formula. But what you can see is this just highlights the amount of achievement gaps in grade level equivalence by socioeconomic status. That is, the growth in the socioeconomic achievement gap is something that is the significant aspect of today's inequality in the system. What we document is here, you can see, let me just highlight one more quick thing, is that state systems that have high per pupil spending and equitable per pupil spending, one thing that they have in common is not only that they have that spending, but they have some of the lowest spending in per capita criminal justice expenditures. New Jersey, Massachusetts, they're like number 1 and 2 in per pupil spending in terms of its equitable aspects as well. And they have some of the lowest per capita expenditures in criminal justice expenditures. And what we're documenting is there's a connection. That's not a coincidence, that these investments in public investments in equitable ways avert future crime costs. By investing in children, they can achieve their potential and in ways that lessen not only the achievement gap, but their subsequent outcomes beyond education. Earnings.
If I may interject there, which I think is an excellent point. I just want to point out for our audience, since we're in Texas, that in Texas, we actually spend more annually per prisoner, right, to incarcerate a prisoner. We spend more on that per person annually than we do on per pupil spending. So it's a problem in many
public schools. For public schools.
Yeah. So I just want to point out for our Texas audience.
No, that's great, because I didn't know that statistic off the top of my head for Texas, but yes, exactly. And here's the point. The equity mission should be enough rationale for us to respond. But even if you didn't buy the equity and moral, that our public budgets are a moral document, as Dr. King said, there is an efficiency. These have long-run benefits and costs. So segregation has major economic consequences on not just African-American and Hispanic and poor children's futures, but really they have a reckoning that we all experience when we don't take these matters seriously. And we're seeing that with the racial unrest of this period. So again, because I want to get to the close, open up for discussion, the thing I want to highlight here is that this difference between Massachusetts and California, what we document is because of the California school funding reforms that began in 2013 through 2019, we're able to document that narrowing of California and California and Massachusetts, where you see for every level of socioeconomic status, Massachusetts has a higher level of educational attainment. We show that the progressivity of the funding formula plays a significant role, and we find it's significantly narrowed. Now, again, I'm going to actually not go into this discussion, but I'll just highlight that this wasn't incrementalism, that a lot of our policies are small and not commensurate with the challenge of the moment. These were significant and bold reforms. California is the largest, most diverse state system in the country. 1 in 8 children are educated in California. And there's some lessons even for Texas school system, et cetera. This was on the eve of the Great Recession, so there was a lot of hemorrhaging of funding for schools because of the decline in housing values following the Great Recession. And this really turned the tide. And what we show is there was an 8-year rollout of this $18 billion commitment. And because of that rollout, that progressive rollout where the level of funding from the state depended on the district's percent of student disadvantage. So that by the final year of implementation, if you were one of the most impoverished districts, you got $3,500 in new funding from the state versus just 5 years before, you know, very little of that funding was received. We were able to trace that out to show that increase in spending led to significant improvements in every subject, every grade, and in every school that received that increase in funding. We were able to use the full universe of public school records. That's 6.5 million school children in each year that we were able to leverage for that work. And it led to significant improvements in high school graduation rates. So I want to end on a positive note that when I talked about the desegregation impacts, it's not only that it affected those children that were exposed, but it affected their children into the 3rd generation. So we find that the effects of parental school segregation, exposure on the next generations, like the graduation from high school, reverberates, and we see significant improvements in Black children's high school graduation rates as a function of how exposed their parents had been as children to integrated schools. So I'm gonna close there. I promised to close by 10:50. I'm 3 minutes over my time. So let me, whatever else I was gonna say, I'll only highlight this one bullet, which is the recent surges in political polarization, racial intolerance in adulthood, we find are linked to this lack of school age exposure to diversity that accompanied resegregation of schools, and that these targeted investments more than pay for themselves down the road in less spending on remediation, public assistance, healthcare, crime, while having the benefits of equity and value and diversity in our communities. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to a very engaging conversation with all of you.
Thank you so much, Rucker. That was really, really interesting.
I'm gonna just close my slide just so that I can get us out of screen share mode. But yes, I want to hear all ears and reactions and thoughts. There's a lot that
there's a lot we need to talk about, and frankly, there's a lot that I want to connect to what's going on in Houston right now, and what should Houston do next, right? Because we've got a lot of stuff going on. But before we get there, we got a lot of questions from the audience. One question that came up multiple times was that, you know, you shared a lot of different outcomes that were all significantly improved after desegregation. But one outcome that you didn't mention that people were curious about was suspensions. And I'm wondering if you happen to have any information about that, but even if you don't, I do have some Houston information about that, but I want to give you a chance to talk first about that.
I'd love to hear the Houston data and evidence. I think one of the things that when I talk about teacher diversity, I also mean like teacher professional development about how we engage with a more diverse student body. We're tackling that at the higher education level. We know as professors, we don't have the kind of professor level diversity that we're aiming for, that our students are more diverse than the current composition of professors. There's ways in which we have to think about how implicit biases affect teacher expectations for child achievement, and that the suspension rates are not really solely determined by the student behavior, but rather adult perceptions of that behavior, and in ways that aren't addressing the out-of-school factors that sometimes children are struggling with, and the ways in which we don't have kind of empathy, right? And it's kind of the ways in which empathy and being exposed to different types of communities that I think is a central part of the teacher diversity that is kind of part of that whole integration that doesn't happen in a kind of singular policy, but it happens through the implementation with fidelity of the spirit of such a policy.
Mm-hmm. And along the lines of what you said earlier about how it's not just about the students' behavior per se, but rather all these other factors, you mentioned teachers, but in Houston, we did some research looking at the likelihood of suspensions, both in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions, and controlling for all the typical factors that you would think would predict those disciplinary actions. But
Yes.
We found that one very important factor, it was the school's racial composition. And that in Houston, students that are in—
Apart from the poverty concentration, for example.
Right.
Distinct from.
Yeah, it makes it more likely, much more likely, that a student is suspended if they're in a school with a high proportion of Black and Hispanic students, but especially so for Black students. So that's the kind of thing that we know that's happening now. So we don't have the comparisons over time like you do, but even like at one point in time, if we have variation, right, and we can explore that and we can see that there are these very clear patterns, again, pointing to the overarching theme that we must desegregate and integrate.
Yes, I think that's critical. And I think, there's some new research in the impacts of restorative justice policy. One of my PhD students, Sean Darling-Hammond, has dissertation research he's doing that's trying to look at how do restorative justice policy interventions disrupt what I call the school to prison pipeline. Well, how do we disrupt the systems that otherwise have these implicit biases that, require us to be explicit about how race, I think we sometimes have the ostrich syndrome where when we have fear, when it's a very politically charged issue, we kind of bury our head in the sand and want to just talk about the poverty part, but not how race and structural racism has a way of affecting these processes in biased ways. Yeah, I love the work. I'd love to hear and have you send me your study.
Yes, that's HERC research on that issue. So several people, of course, want to know, well, then practically speaking, like get as practical as you possibly can. And you did allude to some of these efforts to integrate, but people want to know how can we integrate today? And let me just give you a little bit of background for Houston, or context for Houston. Sarah, do you happen to have that map I sent you? If you could show that to our audience. It's a map of the school districts in Harris County. So this is the county that Houston is in, and these are all the school districts in Harris County. And Rucker, I should have sent this to you beforehand. I'm sorry I didn't, but I'm sure this map isn't surprising to you. So it shows the percentage of non-Hispanic whites students that are enrolled in each of these public school districts in our county. And you can see there's a very clear pattern here that the districts that are in the center of the county white students are underrepresented, and the districts in the periphery of the county, white students are overrepresented. And there are huge differences. I mean, you can see like Houston ISD, which is the largest school district in the state of Texas, and one of the largest in the country. I think it's about the 7th largest in the country. It's 9% white, right? And there's a school district next to it, Alief ISD. It's, you know, like, what does it say, 4% white? I mean,
yes.
And then,
and really this really mirrors the pattern of the country in many respects, that roughly 40 to 42% of Black and Hispanic students today attend schools with less than 10% of their peers white. And I want to highlight that the school district boundaries and how they're drawn are not like some accident. Like,
right.
A lot of this is policy induced, where these lines, they're invisible, but they're not any less powerful instruments of segregation when they're used for those purposes. So I think, you know, that's a point that certainly we have to see more of and have discussions around. Yes, I
and
hear
of course,
you.
this goes in line with what you mentioned earlier during your presentation, that about 2/3 of segregation is between districts,
Yes.
rather than within districts, and that's the case here, right?
Yeah, and what that signifies too, right, is that busing can't be the solution that it was in the earlier era, where a lot of the integration could happen within school district boundaries. When so much of it is in outlying areas, busing really isn't the instrument that can tackle that. And
so what is?
The housing policy, right? Even when Donald Trump is saying these things about, you know, beware suburban families, you know, of these people, be fearful of these people promoting mixed income housing. You know, that's like an old argument to kind of ensure that segregation goes unabated. And so, you know, I'm not suggesting that this path is the politically expedient one. I'm saying the path through housing policy reforms is the one that will lead to genuine progress, which is why my first statements were, it's in education and housing that the opportunities for children are most impacted, and it's where civil rights policy has had the least progress, and it's that part of the segregation. So yeah, I'm not trying to minimize the challenge. I'm just trying to say, if it's policy, if it was created by policy, certainly we can embrace the idea that policy can be designed to be the prescription for change. It's not like this is all just parents choosing. And a lot of the parent choice movement is about without recognition of what's the nature of the choice for low-income families, right? It's not recognizing that parental wealth is a precondition to be able to exercise choice. Right. Middle-class families with wealth can move to different areas if they're not satisfied. That's not the kind of privilege that lower-income families have as access.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up choice, because of the fact that in Houston in particular, choice has been extremely important for a long time. In fact, you should know that Houston ISD is a school choice district, and meaning that you don't have to go to the school that you're zoned to, you can go to within the district, right? But you just saw the map, right? And or actually, even within HISD, there's segregation within the district as well. I mean, it hasn't really had the impact that we all thought it might have, or that we hoped it would have. School choice is exactly what you just said. Some have more choice than others, and it's just sort of reinforcing, in some ways, exactly the issue that we were trying to address, right?
It's not just your school policy that can fully change the arc of this. It has to have some, you know, integration of the housing and education policy. And I think there's something about this moment of our racial national reckoning. Unfortunately, it shouldn't require like tragedy for us to like lay bare facts, but it's not really just in the policing and criminal justice sector that these issues have their roots. Many of these issues have roots in educational equity of the conversations we're talking about. So yeah, I think, I want to maybe talk less and just hear rapid fire your thoughts, ideas, as well as those from the audience, as opposed to dominating too much of my reactions at this point. I want to, make sure that we hear. I want to listen more.
Yeah. Well, you want to hear thoughts particularly about housing and education, or are you asking about?
Sure, any of those things in terms of being pragmatic about prescriptions for change, what it's going to take. It's something where we didn't have the best evidence on the effects of school spending. We didn't have the best evidence on the effects of early pre-K investments. We in real time certainly didn't have all of the effects on school integration. I think as that evidence has converged in more of a consensus, not just from my work, but people like Sean Reardon, who have documented using contemporary data that every district that has a significant degree of segregation, there is none in the country for which there's not a large achievement gap.
Right.
So if it was possible to just accept high poverty districts and still have equal educational provision, if that was possible, surely we would have found some best case examples. And so a lot of times people, because like even my work emphasizes school resources, the takeaway then is we could just focus on resources without integration and still achieve those aims. What I'm trying to highlight is you can't do any of them by themselves,
right,
for them to work well. You can't even just do integration and say, if all of the schools that have a high proportion of Blacks and Hispanics are also overcrowded and have mostly inexperienced teachers, you're not going to get middle class families, regardless of race, to buy in to that kind of choice. So that's why I'm saying we have to kind of have all of them put in concert. Okay, I'll stop.
Right. No, so what you were saying, I was like, oh my goodness, it reminds me of separate but equal.
Yeah.
We all know that didn't work.
They don't use the same language, but it's certainly of the same.
It sounds a lot like that. But yeah, so I love the fact that you're highlighting that it's not just education policy per se, right? It's housing, and then really it's other things but we need to really collaborate to work together. Frankly, precisely because our predecessors did exactly that to set up these racist policies, racist systems. Our housing system is racist. I mean, just look at how property values work.
I think you guys had Richard Rothstein as maybe an event at the Kinder Institute or at Rice maybe last year. His book was certainly highlighting some of that history. This work is kind of highlighting the impacts and legacy of that history on educational outcomes, to connect how that history, is related. Yeah, that's right. That's great.
Right. But so in terms of thinking through some of the, like what do we do? Because we want to integrate, we need to integrate, because we know that we're just spinning our wheels otherwise. And we're just talking about, oh, how do we improve educational outcomes? And there are things that we can do to improve, but they're just like little things. They're very incremental, and we have to address this underlying root cause, but we understand that it's long-term. I'm glad you mentioned that. One challenge though, is the fact that it's so long-term. By definition, it exceeds political cycles. It exceeds, a superintendent's, most superintendents don't last that long, right? There's a lot of turnover. It exceeds, so that means that we need to do something that ensures that our efforts last longer than that. And frankly, longer than like this, because that 15-year period that you mentioned obviously had a huge impact and would have had an even longer lasting impact had we not then reversed everything that happened during those 15 years, right? So any suggestions about what we might do to set ourselves up to take on some, because I honestly think that Houston is ready for something like this. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I think that, because I mean, based on all the talk that I've been hearing, and I'm talking about like people that care deeply about Houston, that are very influential here in Houston, that I think people are ready to take this on, but they want to know that it's something that will be impactful and that will last. And so that's why I want to talk about like anything that you've learned from these historically and from these other places that, you know, Michigan, California, that not Michigan, sorry, Massachusetts, California, that have tried to take on these issues and that have made some progress, right? How do we ensure that this is long lasting, or how do we set it up so that it makes it more likely to last long enough for people to see the impact and therefore continue to support it long term?
Yeah, so there's several factors that I think influence whether a social movement can be revived in this area. I think when I say social movement, it means that there's like an urgency. So the thing that you should like be most concerned about is apathy. See, it's when there's a problem and it's right in view and people aren't really like moved to do something about it. That's more dangerous. That's almost as dangerous as the problem itself, is when people have accepted that this is just how it has to be. What I'm suggesting is like, if you think about DNA, like they say sometimes there's certain DNA that skips a generation, right? What I'm suggesting is that there's a multiracial coalition that we witnessed this summer with the protests that wasn't actually even there in the civil rights era in the same way. I'm suggesting we've had like 3+ decades of incremental reforms, and we have seen it not have the lasting sustainable power. And we stopped doing some of the bold prescriptions for change. And I think we would do well to use this moment of COVID and all of the other crises that are surrounding us to reset. And when we reset, it not return to the old normal, but a new normal that draws on this kind of shared future, that segregation harms us all, not at the same time, not in the same degree, but it does harm democracy, it harms equitable access, it harms upward mobility prospects. And when we think about segregation, we must understand it's really hoarding of opportunity. It's not just segregation, it's the hoarding of opportunity that is what is needing to be exposed.
So on that note, related to one of our audience audience members asked a question about because you used the term social movement, and I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I've been feeling like this is a social movement right now. We're in the middle of a social movement. You sound like a sociologist, by the way.
Hey, I take that as a compliment.
Yes,
I'm an economist, but I certainly don't. I think of that as a good.
But so one of our audience members asked, like, how do we ensure that integration doesn't become a violent enterprise? You know, given what happened in the past.
Yeah, I think, in my qualitative research and in my kind of disseminating my work to various communities and to learn and to listen, in the same way I'm trying to definitely want to hear from your audience too. But I think what I learned is that a lot of minority community parents, they have scar tissue from the experiences of past efforts generation ago that caused them to say, well, you know what, we would prefer integrated environments, but like if it's going to be accompanied by more racial bias, more out of school suspension, more kind of biased teacher, kind of resistance from white parents or whatever that community, like not a sense of inclusion and belonging. If that's what it's going to be, we'll just focus on resources. Could you just make sure that our communities have adequate resources? And I think that's kind of where people have kind of come, but it's not because the value of diversity and the value of integration is not still valued. I think it's that people are thinking that ambition is no longer within reach. And I actually think that kind of acceptance is what this social movement needs to be about. Like, I don't want to just say school resources matter, because they do. I don't just want to say pre-K investments matter, and they do. And those two policies have much more political appeal. The integration part is, man, that's the part where it's like, now maybe my superintendent tenureship might be shortened. Now the set of conversations in the school board meetings will be more contentious. So sometimes when you're closer to the real solution, that's where the most resistance is. So sometimes watch how much resistance there is to your pursuit of certain things. And sometimes it's actually a signal that that might be a sweet spot, that the resistance is because power doesn't want to release that hoarding of those resources, and that tool might be able to be more effective in doing that in a holistic way.
And I'm glad you mentioned.
That's just me personally.
No, I'm glad you've mentioned pre-K multiple times, and I want to note that in Houston, HERC has also done quite a bit of research on pre-K, and we found that in Houston specifically, children who attended full-day pre-K were like twice as likely to be school ready in kindergarten than children who did not. So huge impact. I mean, we had to do all kinds of sensitivity analyses to make sure that was right, because we're like, whoa, in education, you never find impacts that large. But no, that's actually the case. So we know it works. We also know that there are some that we can improve the quality. We need to get many more kiddos to enroll in pre-K, because especially right now with COVID, there are even fewer than normal that are enrolling. So we've got to address it. And going back to the equity issue, we need to make sure that there's equitable access to pre-K, and that's something else that there's room for improvement. So I love the fact that you're like tying this all in, but you're right, there's a lot less resistance to pre-K than there is to these other issues, especially integration. And I do want to note, in terms of integration, quite a few, I didn't count, but quite a few people in the audience have asked about charter schools. Because you mentioned at one point that that charter schools have contributed to our segregation patterns. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because quite a few audience members asked about that. Well, how have charter schools contributed? And also, because the charter school movement is quite big here in Texas. And
California too. Yep.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. They are concerned about this. If this is the case, like if this is actually contributing toward segregation, we need to know more about this. So please share a little bit more about how that's working.
Yeah, and let me say, I'm drawing from some other people's work on this as well. But let me just say that, connected to your first point, which was about pre-K investments, I think it's very important to understand that pre-K teachers are the least supported, developed with regard to teacher salaries. So teacher salaries is a part of what school resources buy. They buy more instructional expenditures, ensure smaller class sizes, but also they professionalize the system where we have more teachers, say, with a master's degree in child development. And those parts that do affect how the provision shapes socio-emotional development and outcomes that we can't measure singularly with a test score. So I want to highlight that that's an important part, play-based, not just like regimented, academic, but it's the social-emotional development, the access to pediatric care, the holistic development. And some of those, pieces are part of the quality provision that requires investing in teachers. Because if we're expanding access without also expanding teacher salaries and the investment and sustainability in professional development of those teaching workforce, we're not really valuing the work. So if you start seeing evidence of greater value of the impacts of that spending, we should then, put our, I just think that we need to value our teachers. And that means at the earliest, pre-K as well. So I think sometimes say pre-K or K-12, I'm saying and both.
Yeah.
Integration or resources, I'm saying and both. And I'm not saying and both because I'm just like some idealist. I'm saying and both because that's what is requisite for the change. So charter schools, I think I want to be clear that I'm not anti-charter school. I just am saying this, that are there great charter schools? Harlem Children's Zone. There's evidence of the success of Boston charter schools. I'm not suggesting that there are not cases. I don't know Houston's charter school, evidence, but I think what I'm trying to highlight is that a lot of the charter school movement is emphasizing innovation without evaluation. And innovation without evaluation, right, is a recipe for inefficiency. It means that we have a lot of good intentions, but we don't have commensurate evaluation of whether that's working. And what happens as a result is there's just as many bad schools that are charters as good ones. And there's as much variability in quality among charter schools as traditional public schools. And moreover, it's a drain on the traditional public school system without evidence that's expanding quality options for lower income families. Moreover, which is connected to my first point when I first started this talk, is instruments. Okay, let me put it this way. Our understanding of these issues has highlighted that the how of education policy matters as much as the what. So when I say how, I mean, how is it implemented? So charter schools, for example. In rapidly diversifying suburban areas in Tennessee, in North Carolina, what they have done is had unregulated charter school growth that has enabled those rapidly diversifying suburbs to just create their own separate districts through charter schools. And they'll even have like a title of the charter school name, like German Immersion Academy, to connote who belongs, what kind of student they're trying to recruit. It's like, it's not even that coded. And what I'm saying is what we see in various states is that the unregulated charter school growth is being used as a tool to use state-sponsored taxpayer dollars to actually reinforce segregation. So more rapidly diversifying suburbs could create conditions to have integrated schools. But because of the ways in which the instruments of unregulated charter school growth are being utilized, they're being utilized to basically gerrymander. And it used to be if you did that, you had to at least pay for a private school out of your own resource. So at least the segregation wasn't coming from taxpayer dollars. But it's even worse that it's taxpayer dollars that are actually exacerbating the segregation. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily the situation in Houston, but because it's a copycat policy, when it happened in North Carolina successfully, then it happened in Tennessee. When it happens in Tennessee, it starts spreading. And I'm concerned that that unregulated charter school growth under the guise of school choice, and who can resist school choice? But I'm saying without guidance on equity, a lot of the charter school growth, when I say unregulated, they don't have to align themselves with the equity guidelines that traditional public schools. And so that's what I'm saying kind of creates a opportunity for segregation to just be even more reinforced.
Yeah, and the national data that I've seen, the most recent national data on charter schools shows that charter schools are becoming increasingly segregated over time. And in particular, they have experienced a lot of growth among Hispanics, that Hispanic students are, the proportion of Hispanic students attending charter schools has gone up. And I'm not just talking about Houston, because there are a lot of Hispanics in Houston, but I'm talking about nationwide. That seems to be the pattern. And you're right to bring up choice again, that choice actually could, it's so intriguing because it's appealing because it seems like it should be able to help us integrate, but that's not how it has worked, and that's also the case in terms of charter schools or even magnet schools, and so forth. So it's something that that we need to think about in terms of choice. That's why sometimes I don't know if you've heard controlled choice.
Yes, so that's what I think is important. Like, court orders are not what I'm prescribing. Like, a return to court order, we need everybody to buy into this movement, or at least a multiracial coalition to. So yeah, I agree with the kind of controlled choice. What we mean is that with equity guidance, with equity guidelines. And I would just say that a lot of Hispanic and Black parents that I talk to, they're looking for a multicultural curriculum. And so when they don't see it present in a traditional public school, they are sometimes turning to charter schools because they're looking for a multicultural curriculum. They're looking for more teacher diversity. They're looking that the teachers would be more teachers that look like them. And I think that that's great. What I'm saying is that should not be the choice before minority parents, to have to choose resources or a multicultural curriculum. Like, you should be able to have a multicultural curriculum with good resources, with teacher diversity, with like that should be part of what is a good school. That should be part of our definition of integration itself. Yeah. And I'm just saying, when you see people opting for, you know, say, yeah, I'll just leave it at that to make sure I don't.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Rucker. This has been really, really enlightening and timely, because I will say again, I really believe that we're at a moment, especially here in Houston, where we can do this. We can do this. We can integrate our schools, not just desegregate. We can integrate our schools. Our predecessors were very effective in setting things up in a very segregated manner. We're smarter than them. Why can't we undo what they have set up and turn things around? We can set up a new system that really aims to integrate, and by doing so, improve the outcomes of everyone. We already know it works. We don't have to take it's not some big risk, right? Like some innovation, that's a problem with innovation. It's risky. In this case, we know it works.
And it's a journey, not a destination. So it requires continual, you know, kind of refinements. It's not like you just decide. It's kind of, and I see it as the faith community connecting with the school community, connecting with the housing policy community, with the education policy community. Like, I think when I say integrate, I mean integrate the parts of research community, practitioner community, policy community, the faith community. I think we all have an investment in our future that's shared, and that integration should be a cornerstone of that new movement.
Absolutely. So thank you so much. And to our audience, Rucker's book is available for purchase through retailers worldwide. Of course, you can get more details on our website, kinder.rice.edu. Also, there's an upcoming webinar on November 11th. The Kinder Institute Forum will feature Tamika Butler. Butler's a national expert and speaker on issues related to the built environment and equity. And Tamika will discuss institutional oppression and the importance of inclusive urban design. So you won't want to miss that. You can register for the upcoming webinar by visiting kinder.rice.edu or by scanning the QR code on the screen that you see in front of you. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.